In this video, I'm going to break down the making of the globe staircase environment. I'm always trying to experiment with different workflows, primarily to allow me to create environments faster. So that way you can go from start to finish in the shortest amount of time while still having the quality of your environments pushed to your max potential, to your max levels. So in this particular environment, what I wanted to do was focus entirely modeling the environment in my 3D modeling application. In my case, it's Maya. And I wanted to focus on the modeling process, create the entire environment in Maya, and then just simply export everything out of Maya into UE5. So I don't have to reconstruct the environment inside UE5. I would just export everything I've done into UE5, and then I would have a complete environment exactly the way I had it in Maya. And then I wanted to focus using Quixel Bridge, the Megascan assets, primarily the materials and decals, to texture the environment. So that allowed me to focus on modeling and not environment construction, and then just texture the assets using Quixel Bridge, and then just use UE5's lighting lumen to finish everything off. So here is the complete breakdown of everything I did for the making of the globe staircase environment. The idea and the inspiration behind this environment came from a single image. I found this about a year ago just looking for other things until this popped up, and I thought it was very cool. I like the concrete, brutalist architecture, but it also had that science fiction vibe, futuristic style. And I usually save these images as ideas for possibly to come back to. So this idea has been on my mind for almost a year, and it's something that I wanted to do but just didn't have time to do it. So once I decided to work on this, I collected more reference images, but I didn't want to recreate the image itself, model it one for one, and just make a copy of what I have from reference to model into UE5. I wanted to put my own spin on it, put my own ideas into it. And one of the ways you could expand on the reference image itself without having to copy is you take an image into Photoshop and then you use generative fill to give you ideas. So you simply bring in the photo into Photoshop, you expand the canvas so you have a lot more space around it. Then you select the image using the marquee tool. Then you invert that selection. And then you use generative fill and let Photoshop AI generative fill create the information for you and give you ideas. And I ran through a few options and it created this image for me. So essentially gave me an idea of this underground environment theme with some kind of tunnels below it that lead to nowhere. And this is where it clicked for me. And this is what I wanted to do. So once I had the idea, I wanted to jump right into Maya and begin modeling. For the entire modeling process, I used Maya. And as I mentioned, I wanted to experiment with the workflow of creating this environment entirely in Maya and then just exporting everything as one single FBX and then bringing it over into UE5. So I did not want to separate and create modular pieces, export them one by one, or even using the game exporter, and then having to reconstruct this entire environment in UE5. I simply wanted to have what I see and what I've modeled in Maya, and then have the same exact thing exported and then imported in UE5. That was my biggest thing that I wanted to focus on, not having to reconstruct this in UE5, as you usually would have to. Now, this process, of course, will not allow, or it would be very difficult to expand on this environment. So essentially what I see here in Maya, this is exactly what I get in UE5, and there are no variations that I could expand on. So most of these pieces right here, they're still somewhat modular, but they're not on the grid. They're not being snapped to the 000 world space for export. I essentially split some of these pieces up so I can easily construct this inside Maya, but I did not export one single piece and then having to duplicate that in UE5. I just made it easier for me to construct this inside Maya. So these are not really modular, but they are repeating for easier modeling and construction in Maya. And here's what the environment looks like in UE5. Again, all of these pieces are exactly what I had in Maya. Solid pieces of geometry, static meshes that were exported from Maya and then brought into UE5. So all of these are separate meshes as you saw in Maya. They were just simply exported as a single FBX, and then on import I did not combine the meshes. And then I simply dragged all the single meshes from the FBX, from the import, and I'll show you the process that I did in just a minute. But essentially here are all the pieces that I brought in. And these were brought in as a single FBX. I did not import them one by one. And then I simply selected all of these and dragged them into the level, and it reconstructs your environment inside UE5. Now, again, the downside for this, and I'll kind of come back to this, is the pivot point. Because I exported everything as a single FBX, so I essentially selected everything inside the level, and this is that front wall. I just moved it out of the way so I can see inside. I essentially selected all the meshes. I exported them as a single FBX. That means that all the pivot points for all the static meshes get repositioned into the 0,0 world space, which is somewhere around here. So this is why when you bring things into UE5 as a single FBX and then don't combine the meshes, so they're all separate, all the pivot points are repositioned in the world origin. So this is the downside of this method, is I can't really take any of these assets and just duplicate and reposition. I could, but again, it's not very user-friendly because of the pivot point. Now, I could reposition the pivot point, but then I wouldn't need to use that method. So if I were creating modular pieces, then I would break this up a lot more. I would have these pillars as a single static mesh. The wall, maybe this wall on the bottom would be a single static mesh. Wall on the top, maybe a single static mesh. The stairs would be their own separate mesh, and then of course the pivot point would be exactly where I needed to be in order to duplicate this across the environment. But again, that was not the point for this, because I wanted to create this in Maya, model it, have it be done, and just simply focus on texturing and lighting inside UE5. And with that, I really created this environment a lot quicker than if I had to reconstruct it inside UE5 by creating individual modular pieces. So I really love working with this method of how fast I was able to model this, UV it, bring it into UE5, and then just texture it and light it. Now let me cover a bit more about the process of modeling and then exporting from Maya to UE5 and some of the options that I used. The first thing I want to touch on is the scale. Modeling things to scale from Maya to UE5 so they're one-to-one is very important. Now I have a few tutorials on making sure that you create things to scale in Maya to UE5, so I'm going to link those in the description as well as within the blog post. But the first thing you want to make sure is you have your grid set up correctly in Maya to match UE5, and here's mine. In a separate tutorial I'll go over what each of these mean, but you can just note and maybe change them now and then go into depth by watching the tutorial. And you can also see that I have a scale reference inside my scene, human mannequin, that I exported from UE5 and then imported it into Maya to help me build things to scale. And the height of this scale reference is 180 centimeters, which is about roughly 6 feet. So the environment and the architecture needs to match the human reference scale you have inside the scene. So this is the very first important part of creating environments in Maya for UE4 or for UE5, is having the right scale and dimensions. So everything you create looks real, doesn't seem too small, doesn't seem too big, and you don't have those obvious proportion issues. And once you get the scale and the dimensions down, then you are free to model the environment that will look right. Here is the first rough blockout that I did. I kept the geometry extremely simple, very primitive, so I can get the size, the dimensions, and the overall mood and feel and essence of the environment. I wanted to get the proportions down, I wanted to get the right construction of the environment, and then bring it into UE5 and begin testing lighting, just to see what it would look like. So all of these are primitive shapes, and I simply created one, then duplicated, and just basically created the entire scene what it would look like in order to test the dimensions and the entire environment, so that way I can bring it into UE5 as soon as possible. And this was my template, the blueprint, onto which the final environment was created. So this is another crucial step in the production pipeline, making sure that you have your blockout right, because that's going to be your blueprint for the final environment. If the size is not correct here, then it's not going to be correct in the final work. So this is where you test things out, you move things. This is a very fluid, flexible process of figuring things out. So once I had the blockout, what I did was, let me move this wall back so we have something in front. Here's the entire export process that I did. I would select everything, then I would go to File, Export Selection. Make sure I was exporting as FBX export. Choose a folder where you want to export. I'm going to overwrite this scene test. Everything will be exported into a single FBX file. Here are some of my settings. Smooth in groups, smooth mesh, make sure it's named, location selected, and click export selection. And yes, because I'm overwriting an existing file, but for you, you'll have a new file created. So it takes all these selected meshes and exports them into a single FBX file. Then in UE5, start a new scene. And I usually choose the basic map template because it gives you all the necessary actors to start with right away. You don't have to insert them yourself. And then choose a folder where you're going to begin to import things into for the project. So I'm actually going to choose the test folder, and let's do static meshes. So this is where I want to import things into, as I show you in this tutorial. But for me, I have a dedicated folder selected and created for all the assets and the maps and the materials to organize. So let me go to static meshes, then take that single FBX file and just simply drag and drop it right into this folder inside the content browser. So this is the scene test. And here are the settings that you would want to begin to enable and disable for this workflow process. So I did build nanites for the meshes because I was going to use lumen lighting, and nanites and lumen works really well together. I did generate missing collisions, so that way I can spawn inside the environment and walk around. However, I did have to tweak a few, and I'll show you that later. I did generate light map UVs as a default, just in case if I wanted to come back and do baked lighting with these meshes. But these also depend on your UVs, which we'll cover in a bit. Then the important property you want to make sure you do not have enabled is combined meshes. I want to have all the separate meshes that I have eventually as the final environment. I do not want to have this FBX combined as one single object. If I enable this, all the selected meshes become one static mesh. So the entire environment becomes one single mesh, and I do not want that. I want to have everything I have as separate. Having separate meshes also works best with Lumen, because Lumen does not like large meshes, and you will have problems lighting environments that are made up of one large complex mesh. So you want to break those things up. This is why modular meshes work really well with Lumen, just the way Lumen works. It needs separation of meshes rather than one single large environment mesh. And also I did create new materials. This assigns a Lambert material on top of my meshes, so that way I don't have that world grid that you see here on the floor. So with all these settings, go ahead and import all, or import, doesn't really matter. Anything that comes up here, I can go ahead and ignore because this has to do with UVs. And since this blockout does not have any UVs, all the static meshes, all the exported geometry has not been UV'd yet. This is why you get a lot of the errors. And here are all the meshes that made up the blackout environment. Now there is a problem with the names, and I'll show you that later. But in the blackout process, I do not save this. I simply wanted to create the blackout and temporarily export and import, so I can see what the environment looks like, see how the lighting works, and just kind of the mood and the feel, the scale, that everything is working correctly. In the end, in this blockout process, I did not save this. And this is very important because I wanted to have this iteration process of constantly bringing things in, testing, and then getting back into Maya to continue modeling. And these names eventually I did change, and you just have to rename your meshes. And in the final environment, everything was renamed and it was imported correctly with all the proper names. So that's something we're also going to come back to. But here are all the separate meshes. So how do you construct this environment very quickly without having to drag every single one of these meshes and position them, because that would be a pain, and that kind of kills the entire experimentation process that I had in mind. So you simply select all the meshes and ignore the materials. Actually, this is a static mesh. Here's the material that I created by default, which I wanted, which assigns a flat, off-white, kind of grayish color to it. So it's easier to see the lighting and see the construction. Again, I did not want to have this grid on top of all the meshes. So with all the static meshes selected, just simply left-click, hold, and drag them into the level. And then let's go inside and position and take a look. Here it is. Now, the one thing I also do is I make sure that with all the meshes selected, I go to location and I type in 0 for every single one. So this positions all the meshes at the pivot point to the world origin 000 world space. So this means that if I ever, let's say, delete this mesh and I want to reposition it, like I forgot to place it, I can just simply drag this into the level and I would just zero out the location. It would be positioned exactly where it was in Maya. And this is why I zero out all the meshes instead of just dragging them and leaving them. The environment would be created, but then if you ever move any of the meshes by accident, let's say, or you forgot, or you just need to, like, you basically moved it by accident and then you want to reposition it, super simple way to reposition back to where it needs to be in the environment is just zero out the locations. And here it is. Here's your entire environment, exactly how it looks in Maya. The next thing, and we're going to cover this now because it has to do with lighting. You can see that the auto exposure is just illuminating the entire scene, and it auto corrects and makes the environment bright. And we do not want this, especially when you just want to see the lighting, the indirect lighting coming in from up above. And I wanted to experiment with the lighting and see what it looks like without having this auto exposure taking place. And this has to do with post-process volume. So you usually need the post-process volume right away in order to clamp those values as you work. And I always, when I start a new map, I always disable auto exposure or control it. So go to visual effects and insert post-process volume into your level. Make sure it's selected and then go to details and type in unbound so you can search for it, and enable infinite extent unbound. This will make this post-process volume universal. Now, we still haven't clamped or controlled those values, so make sure the post-process volume is selected and go to exposure. For this method, I am going to use a different method that I usually use. Usually, I just enable minimum and maximum values and change these to 0, and this clamps it down. However, because this is more of indirectly lit environment, I will not have any direct lighting other than the directional light bouncing above the hole and then just entering into this environment. So I'm not going to have actual direct light in here. So I used a slightly different method, an alternate method of controlling auto exposure. So instead of using these values, let me go ahead and disable them. So that's going to start taking effect, the auto exposure. For this method, I used metering mode, enable this and change it to manual. Then enable exposure compensation and apply physical camera exposure. And then come back to exposure compensation and begin to adjust this. So I set it, I think in the end it was 13, but I started playing around with the values in order to control the exposure compensation and make the environment kind of back to where it needs to be. And this is where you can increase this value for indirectly lit areas of the environment and for environments that are primarily lit with indirect lighting, and increase this value in order to infuse it with more light. So I think in the end it was 13 or maybe 12. But basically have this value to play around to clamp the auto exposure. And then if you press Ctrl L, hold it down, and I just adjusted my directional light right about there. So here I was kind of testing the blackout environment and seeing how the lighting would look. And let me increase it to 13. So you can see right away that just the blackout, once I get the scale, once I get the right size, and then I export it for testing, and then I begin to play around with lighting, my environment already is there. I can see the final piece in my mind right now with just minimal amount of work. And from here on out, I know it will work. The environment will look good. All I need to do is model, detail, UV, and then of course texture and light. But early in this process, I already know it's going to work and I really like it. So at this point, you go back to Maya and begin to model further. You have the template, you have the blueprint of the environment, the shell, and you keep that. And then you just begin to model further, add detail, and build on the environment so you can create the rest of the environment. Now, the important part at this point right now, I did not save the scene. I did a lot of testing, just bringing things in, testing, and then deleting it. So because I did not name anything, because I wanted to just test and experiment, I went ahead and not saved this scene, because this is just a blackout. And in the end, I will have a different set of static meshes and they will all be named correctly. And this was just a test. And I just went back to Maya so I can begin the modeling process. Since now I know the environment looks correct, the lighting would look good, and I just need to start working in the environment and actually model everything. So I began the modeling process. Here's the first iteration where I just kind of began to create the staircase, work on the stairs. I expanded the environment a little further out, so it's a little bit wider. I still continue to export everything and do that test import to see the completed work back in UE5. So I did that quite a lot. And again, I did not save. That's a very important part. I did not save any of it when I imported it. Then I would come back to Maya and continue modeling further. Here is the next variation. Originally, I wanted to include glass instead of railing, but then I opted out of having glass because I wanted to have more of a older kind of abandoned environment, so glass wouldn't fit. But you can see I began to add more detail to the columns, more detail for the platform, more detail for the stairs. There's now railing here at the top. Platforms at the top have more detail. The entire staircase and the curved walkway was complete. as well as more detail for the columns in the back. And I began to experiment with adding the doorways for some of the second floor, where the platforms would go across. Here was the third variation. Again, I just continued to add more and more detail. Now all of these have railings. More detail was added for the upper floor. I now have doors and door handles for everything upstairs as well as towards the end. And again, just more detail. Just kind of continuing to go through the process of refining and doing additional passes of adding detail to modeling. Also, continuously exported everything by selecting all the pieces and exporting them as one single FBX. Of course, in this case, because I have a wall in the front, I would just move that out, but then I would zero out the transformation, as well as for the two pieces for the ceiling, zero out so they're positioned back, and then I would export all of this in their position and import it into UE5. Now, the important part of a lot of this process is once you begin to construct, I did zero out a lot of the transformations. This means that once I had, let's say, the sphere positioned where I want it in Maya, you can see the translation are all zeroed out. This allows me to always bring back the geometry exactly where I need it to be in Maya as I construct the environment. So if I move it by accident, or if I need to move it, I can always bring it back when I need to export. So this is why for the walls, as well as for the ceiling, they're all zeroed out. I just needed to move them out of the way so they're not in view, so I can continue modeling, and then I just move them back so I can go ahead and export and test. And here was the final modeled environment. All the detail has been complete. Every single piece and that transformation has been frozen to 0, 0. So again, if I ever move it, if I need to move it, I can always bring it back. So this is the final environment. And also the important part here is I renamed everything. So you can see every single piece of geometry has a name. So these are the names that are going to be included inside UE5. And it just makes things easier for me so I don't have that default name of cube or sphere or whatever assigned when I work in UE5. And it just makes searching inside UE5 easier. So everything has been renamed. And let me go ahead and export this and show you what the final modeled environment looks like in UE5. So let me position this back. Again, the process was exactly the same as before. I just simply select everything that I want to export. And you can see my scale box and my scale human. The references that I use are all locked. So I am not exporting those. I'm just exporting the geometry. Then again, you go to File, Export Selection. All the options are the same. And I'm just going to overwrite over the scene test. So all the geometry gets exported into that single FBX file. Now back in UE5, I would usually have already deleted and cleared so I can just bring in a new scene with all the new meshes. But let me show you, if you happen to still have all the old meshes in here and you didn't delete it, you need to delete it from the level so you can import that new piece, new FBX with all the new meshes. So first you need to remove everything from your level and make sure that nothing is left over. Then you can take all the meshes that you imported, including the materials, and just delete them from the level. If it says force delete, you usually don't want to force delete it because it's going to leave empty references. So you just make sure you need to remove it from the level first, maybe even save that level and restart the level, and then delete it from the content browser. So make sure it says delete and not force delete. So I'm going to go ahead and remove it. Now everything is clean and I can go ahead and bring in the new version. So again, I'm just going to take that scene test FBX and just drag it into appropriate folder. All the options are going to stay the same. And let's go ahead and import. Then just grab all of the static meshes and not any materials that were created. So I have 3 materials created and I'll show you what that means because I separated some meshes to have multiple material slots. But you select all the meshes, drag them into the level, and then make sure with all of them still selected, you zero out the location. So now they're all positioned exactly how they are positioned in Maya, and you avoid any problems if you ever move them. And you can see that every single mesh has scene underscore test, which is the name of the scene that you exported. So it appends the name of the scene and then the name of the mesh. So of course, your final scene should not have scene test. For me, for my meshes, for my final map, all the static meshes were named globe staircase scene underscore name of the mesh. So just name it appropriately for your final import. And here it is, the final environment, modeled and imported. And again, the beauty of this, it looks exactly how you modeled in Maya. And I did not have to construct this over again by exporting modular separate static meshes and then having to reconstruct this environment in UE5. So that was the modeling process that I used to create this entire environment in Maya and then bring it into UE5 and have everything be matched up one-to-one. Exactly what I modeled in Maya was transferred over into UE5 without me having to reconstruct it. Next, I want to cover the UVing process. So in this final environment, every single mesh has been UV'd. Let me go ahead and open up the UV editor. All of the meshes will use tile and textures. And many of these meshes, if I select them, you can see there are overlapping textures, overlapping UVs. But that's by design, because it's going to have the same texture applied to many of the faces of these meshes. And since they're going to be repeatable, it's going to contain the same texture. Many of these UVs can be overlapped and sitting on top of each other. Another thing you'll notice is the UVs, the 0 to 1 space. This is where you usually unwrap your UVs and position inside that 0 to 1 space. However, these meshes, their UVs extend beyond 0 to 1 space. And again, also that is okay because I'm using tile and textures. And I matched the textile density from all these meshes to be the same. So this way there's no difference in the texture resolution when I begin to apply the textures. So every single one of these shells has the same textile density. And if I come over here into transform, scroll down, and let me go ahead and select a shell, and I click get. Most of the shells will have 5.12 as a textile density. If I select the stairs, for example, let me go ahead and select them, go to UV shell, click get. You can see it's very similar. The stairs are a little smaller, but as long as they're within the same similar range, the resolution will look good on all of the meshes. Let me go ahead and select the platform, go to UV shell and click get. You can see 5.12. And if I go ahead and just select any of them, they will have the textile density set to very close to 5.1 and maybe slightly smaller here and there, but not by much. And this was by design because I wanted to maintain the textile density the same across all meshes. So when I apply a texture on it, you will not get low resolution on one piece of geometry and then high resolution of that texture on another piece of geometry. And this was very important for me to do. So how did I arrive at that textile density number? First, you have to decide for every 1 meter of geometry or 100 centimeters by 100 centimeters, what is the texture resolution do you want to have? So for 1 by 1 meter, you could have a texture size that is a power of 2, starting at 2 pixels and doubling every time you go up. So it would be 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 1024, and so on, all the way up to 8192, thus increasing the texture resolution size for that piece of world geometry. And this is your standard metric of deciding how much texture resolution you're going to have for the 1 by 1 meter of geometry of world space. This is where you start. And then of course you can have larger geometry, but for larger geometry pieces, you still use the same textile density. So here I have a plane that is 1 meter by 1 meter or 100 centimeters by 100 centimeters. And the resolution of this piece of geometry, I decided to have at 512 pixels by 512 pixels, meaning that if I have a texture that's 512 by 512, it should be mapped onto 1 meter by 1 meter of geometry. And if I have geometry that is, let's say 2 by 2 or 200 by 200 centimeters of geometry, so slightly bigger, let me just kind of duplicate this mannequin. So for geometry that is 2 meters by 2 meters, I would need a texture with a resolution of 1024 by 1024 or 512 but tiled 2 times. But my textile density for this piece of geometry, world geometry, would still be at the same value. So if I select the shell and I click get, this number will change, but underneath the map size, I would increase it to 1024 because that would be my texture resolution in order to map it onto a 2 by 2 world piece of geometry. And I click get, same number, same textile density. And one more example, if I had a wall that is 4 meters by 4 meters, in order to maintain the textile density across this geometry, I would need a 2048 texture. And if I click get on this shell, same textile density. Or again, I could use a 1K texture for this wall, but I would need to tile it 2 times in order to maintain the same textile density. So for a 4x4 wall, I would need a map size of 2048 to keep that same textile density, that same information within that texture. So no resolution would appear out of place when objects are placed next to each other. So essentially, for every meter of geometry, I have 512 pixels of texture information that's going to be contained in it. And that's what I decided to do. You could have for 1 meter of geometry and use 1024 or 1K texture map to display the information, the resolution of that texture. Or you could have a 2K texture for every 1 meter, or even a 4K. And the higher texture resolution you introduce for 1 meter of geometry, the closer you can come up to it and see all the detail within that texture. So your geometry, your world, your architecture will look really good up close. And usually the standard for most games, and of course it varies a lot depending on the art style, but it varies between 512 pixels for every 1 meter all the way up to 4K for every 1 meter. So it all depends on your target platform, and there's just many different considerations you would have to take. But if you stick anywhere between 512 and 2K for every 1 meter, you should be in good spot. So for this environment, I went with a more moderate size. 1 meter equals 512 pixel texture resolution. So what I did was, in order to determine this number, I simply created a plane that's 100 by 100. This size right here, this would be a 512 by 512 texture. So in my textile density size, I went ahead and on the map size entered 512. Selected the shell and click get. And that gave me the number. So that means from here on out, if I wanted to take this UV shell, and by default it would be some other size, it wouldn't be at this textile density because I changed it. So for example, it could be very small when you map it. You could be working here, but then I wanted to make sure that all the UV shells had the same textile density, so they retain the same texture information and resolution across all my geometry. So then I would select that shell. I knew what my textile density number was, and I would just select that shell and click set. And that resized it for me. And in this case, this textile density or the size of the UV shell is very large because I'm mapping it to a 512 texture. And the textures that I was going to use in Quixel Bridge, I was going to download 2048 by 2048 texture resolution. So I needed to go ahead and actually type that in and set that UV shell because all my textures were going to be that size. They were going to be a 2048 by 2048. And I knew that ahead of time. And then I resized all my shells to retain this map size and retain this textile density. And also in a lot of the tiling textures, you could simply increase the tiling of textures that you apply onto geometry in order to kind of work and deal with this inconsistent texture resolution across your geometry if you didn't set everything across your geometry to the same textile density. So you would have to play around with the tiling in UE5 through the material editor. Now, if this does not make any sense, this comes from experience with UVing and then applying textures onto your meshes at certain texture resolutions, then seeing them together. So the more you work with modeling, the more you work with UVing and texturing your assets, it begins to make a lot more sense. So as a beginner, if you want to learn and begin to create your assets with a lot more accuracy and then UVing them with proper workflow and proper technique, take a look at the course I created, Maya Foundation Home Study course. It will teach you everything you need to know about modeling and then UVing your meshes properly. So the final word on the textile density is my geometry I decided to use for every meter of geometry in world space. It was going to use 512 pixels of texture resolution. And one last thing, remember in Unreal Engine 4 and Unreal Engine 5, the height of a character is 180 centimeters in height, so almost 2 meters. And that should also help you to determine what texture resolution you should want for every meter of your world space. Now let me touch on having different material slots on static meshes. So I do have multiple material slots on certain static meshes here. So for example, this wall, if I select this static mesh and inside the details panel, I have material slot 1 and 2. And of course, if I double click and open up a static mesh editor, I also have it here as well. So I can assign a texture to certain parts of geometry, or assign a material to certain parts of geometry, and I can have two different materials on here. And if I take a look at this, actually this is a door. Let me select something else, this wall. And inside Static Mesh Editor, I can go ahead and isolate. It'll show me which parts have material Lambert 2, or whatever the material I assign onto this later. And here's another one. So I can have two different materials for the pillars, one for the pillar and one for the walls. And that's what I end up doing. So that way I have a little bit of variety on a static mesh instead of the same material being applied to everything here. And I did this to quite a few meshes, such as this platform in the center. It has 3. So it just allows me to have some variety of materials on various static meshes. And like I said, the way I am going to texture this, and the way I did texture as I'm kind of going through the making of, I use Quixel Bridge Megascans, the materials and the decals that are provided there. So that way I just download what I need and then I just drag them onto the parts of the mesh that I need the materials to be on. So the way you do that inside your 3D modeling application, and specifically inside Maya, is you create another Lambert. So by default, everything gets Lambert 1 assigned to your geometry, this gray material. So if I open up Hypershade, here's the Lambert 1. It's always inside the scene and it's always applied on your geometry when you create a new model. So if I right click, I can choose select objects in initial shading group. So it will select everything that has a Lambert 1 applied to it. And then I created another Lambert by simply going into the create panel and created a Lambert 2 and a Lambert 3. And then I assigned Lambert 2 and Lambert 3 for however many material IDs I would want on that mesh to the faces of that geometry. So for Lambert 2, if I just select all the faces, here's Lambert 2. And then just maybe a couple of static meshes. I think it's just the center. Yeah, it's just the center has a third material ID applied. So whenever you apply different materials onto certain parts of the geometry by selecting the faces. So for example, let me go to face component mode. So for example, I just selected the faces, and then in the face component mode, you right click and go to assign existing material and assign a different material. So that allows you to have on import that second material slot or the third material slot, depending however many materials you applied and assigned to those faces in Maya. So with that, with everything UV'd and certain parts of the geometry, certain meshes having 2 or 3 material IDs, and then all of the modeling finished, of course, because you do your modeling first, then you do your UVing process second. Then I went ahead and exported everything, placed everything into where it needed to be, then selected the geometry that I was going to export, that I needed to export, minus, of course, any scale references. And then went to File, Export Selection, and re-export it as a new scene or overriding an existing scene. And then importing it into UE5 using the exact same method I've showed you so far. Let me briefly talk about making changes and updates to your geometry or UVs. So if your environment is done and your UVs are completed and you've already exported and you saved everything, everything has its own unique name. And if you were going to make changes to update to either the UVs or you wanted to add some modeling detail, you can still do that by simply editing the mesh that you need to make changes for while keeping the same name. Or if you need to make any updates to UVs, you can do that as well. And then simply reselect everything again and re-export into that same single FBX file. Then when you are inside UE5, you still have the same names and you basically just select the mesh that you need to re-import. So let's say it was this platform. Find it inside the content browser. You can find quickly by selecting it inside the level, hitting Ctrl B. This will select it inside the content browser, and then right click on it and re-import. This will re-import that mesh and then just save it. Now, if you happen to, let's say, take parts of the mesh, begin to duplicate them and add additional meshes that are not inside UE5 at the moment, and you begin to have new meshes with new names, then at that point, I would probably re-export everything into that same FBX file. So everything is brand new again. But then inside UE5, this is where I would delete everything from the level, delete everything from the content browser, and then re-import as a brand new FBX. So that way you get the new meshes, all the updates and the new names, and everything is a brand new asset on import. So you don't have to deal with inconsistencies of different meshes being added, removed, different names, having to find and import them individually or anything like that. You just simply delete everything and re-import it as one single mesh, like I've showed you. And this is why I recommend that you don't save anything as you do the export, import for testing purposes, for experimentation, until you are done modeling your environment and done UVing it, and you've named everything. So that way you know everything you bring in is completed. But then again, if you need to re-import anything as brand new, extra meshes, that it's a quick process by simply deleting and re-importing and then just zeroing out the locations for all the meshes inside the level. Next, let's cover collisions. So on import, we generated missing collisions. Means that UE5 will create collisions for you based on geometry. Now, they're not going to be perfect, especially for more complex curved geometry, but it's often a good start. And for many cube-like objects, that's enough. Now, if this is a standalone environment where it's not playable, you're not going to be spawning in it, running around, then you do not need any collisions. You essentially created the environment just to take screenshots, do a fly-through. Maybe it's for your portfolio, but you're not going to be spawning and walking through it. But anytime I like to create something that you can explore or even just stand around and move a little bit, just so you get to experience the full 3D, not just a still image. And for this, I had to tweak the collisions that UE5 generated. So the first thing you can do is just take a look at the collisions inside the level by going to Show and Enable Collisions, Alt-C. And for many of these objects, many of these meshes, collisions are going to be unusable. Some things here on the side, those can be used just fine. You just won't be able to walk maybe in between these pillars. But for like these railings, these are pretty good. For many of these, they're just fine as they are. For any cube-like objects that don't have any intricate detail or any curved geometry, most of the collisions are going to do just fine. But also, it's hard to see what's going on if you use this mode. So let me go ahead and disable it. Let's go ahead and spawn. And then you'll know exactly what you would need to tweak. So I'm going to play from here. And as soon as you begin to walk around, well, first of all, we can't even walk onto this rounded platform. And we won't be able to walk up the stairs at all. Here, I'll be able to walk, but the stairs would need to be tweaked. Then most of the rest of the environment, you can pretty much walk around anywhere. And everything just works just fine. Again, I won't be able to walk in here. If I needed, then I would need to tweak those collisions. So primarily, collisions need to be tweaked and changed for the sphere, for the rounded platform, for some of the stairs, and of course the curved platform and the curved stairs. So how do we do that? First, you need to open up the static mesh editor for each of these meshes. Let's go ahead and deal with the railing and the staircase. I'm going to select it inside the level, press Ctrl B to find it inside the content browser. Let's open this up. To see the collisions that UE5 generated, go to Show and enable Simple Collisions. And you can see this is unusable. So what you could do is option number 1 is create custom collisions in Maya and then export them along with the mesh or along with single FBX. That's going to take a little bit of time because there is a naming convention that you have to follow and you have to create the geometry to be very similar to the actual static mesh. The easier way to do this is inside UE5. So you can select existing collision and delete it. Now, if I save it, it will have no collisions. And then you can use under collisions drop-down menu and have any of these presets to generate collisions. Now, most of these will not work for this type of geometry, but for many other type of geometry, it will work. But this is more complex. It's a curved staircase, so none of these will work. The other option you can do is inside convex decomposition. In here, I can define hole count, number of primitives for collisions, and how many verts I want per hole, per primitive collision, and then the precision. So you can tweak around these values. So let's just do one. Let's generate maybe 16. It's going to take a little bit of time the more you pump up these values, but it could give you more accurate collision. I don't want to put these too much, so let's go ahead and hit apply and see what happens. So here's the result, and it's much better. This might be usable. Let me go ahead and save and just spawn and take a look. I'm going to close this for a second. And let me see if I can spawn on top of this. I might not be able to. And I might not be able to actually test this because of the curvature of the staircase. But basically, let me open this back up. But basically, this might be usable. Just due to the collision, seems like I should be able to walk on top of this, no problem. So convex decomposition is pretty good tool to generate quick collisions that are simple and then you could use right away. And if none of them work, you just simply select any of the holes and you can delete them right from here, or you can go to collisions and remove all collisions. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that for now. So let's go ahead and save this, and so we can come back to it. The other way you can do this is by selecting the mesh and enabling a property inside static mesh editor called use complex collision as simple. So every static mesh can have per poly collision, meaning that I can have collision based on the mesh itself rather than primitive holes that are created around it. This is not ideal for gameplay because it's expensive. And ideally you do want to create your own custom collisions either in UE5 or in Maya. So you need those collision holes that are much simpler. But if it's a standalone environment, it's not a game playable environment. You're not going to be creating a game out of it. This is a great quick way to create very accurate collisions. So you can just experience the environment by walking through it and playing through it. So let's go ahead and select this rail. I'm going to press Ctrl B to find it. Let's open this up. And here's how to enable it. Let me show you what the default collision looks like for this. Show simple collision. Completely unusable. You can't even walk into it. So I can go ahead and delete it, or I can leave it. For this case, I'm going to delete it. And let's go into the details panel. I'm going to scroll down to collisions. Right here under collision complexity, I want to change project default and enable complex collision as simple. So this will use complex collision per poly of the actual mesh as simple collision. And it'll get highlighted. And you can see it's extremely accurate. Basically, it's just following the static mesh. So if I save it, close it, and let's do the same thing for this one so I can actually spawn. Let me quickly do this. I'm going to do the same exact thing. Scroll down and use complex collision as simple. Close it. And let me do one more for the railing and actually for the platform. So that way I can actually walk through it. Press Ctrl B, let me find it again. And enable this property. Save it. And one more for this one right here. And use complex collision as simple. Now I should be able to spawn right on top and I'll be able to walk up. And actually for the stairs, when we generated that decomposition hole, it works pretty well. But I could also do the same thing for the stairs. Just use complex collision as simple. And now I can go ahead and go upstairs. And the rest of the collision here works pretty well. And for the sphere, that looks fine to me. And again, I'm using this only for being able to walk through this environment and experience it in third person or first person. So I can actually enjoy and see the environment from player's point of view rather than just grab a screenshot or a video fly through. So this is how I dealt with collisions for this environment. The next step in the process is texturing. Now to keep up with the theme of texturing your environments quickly, I decided not to manually create the textures using Substance Painter. Instead, I decided to use Quixel Bridge, Megascan materials and decals. Many of the materials in Quixel Bridge are already tileable, so that works for this type of environment. And all I have to do is just find them, download them, bring them into this project, and begin to apply them onto different surfaces, different meshes, to decide which ones I want to use. Now you have access to Quixel Bridge right here on the window, Quixel Bridge. And this is where you can download 3D assets to detail your environments with, 3D plans. Surfaces is what I primarily use to texture the walls and the floor and the ceiling and everything else inside the environment, as well as decals. We'll cover decals in a bit, but right now it's all about using surfaces or materials. Now if you want to learn how to use Quixel Bridge to download all of your assets and then texture your environments with, or detail your environments with 3D assets, as well as decals, take a look at the tutorial I did for using Quixel Bridge for UE5. And I go into detail on how to use Quixel Bridge. So once you've gone through Quixel Bridge and you downloaded the surfaces, the materials that you wanted to try things out with and apply to static meshes, everything that you download will be kept from Megascans, from Quixel Bridge, will be kept inside the Megascans folder. And then here I have 3D assets, decals, and surfaces. And on the surfaces, I have a bunch of concrete that I downloaded, some painted metal, and many other ones. I did not use all of them. I just simply downloaded a bunch that I think would look cool on the environment. And to start using them, you simply select the one that you want to use. Make sure you find the material instance inside that folder and just start dragging them onto surfaces. If you don't like that one, you just simply swap it out for something else. Maybe swap it onto the floor. If you don't like that one, you just find the one that you do like, that kind of fits the theme. And this is a really quick way to texture your environment, because the textures and the material instances and the material itself already created, and you just need to find the one you want to use and just drag them onto your meshes. Now you can apply many of these material instances to the local asset inside the level, or you can apply it to the static mesh editor level, which will apply to every instance inside the level. But again, all of these meshes are unique. So in this case, in this particular workflow, I did not use static mesh editor to apply the static meshes, because these meshes are unique. So this mesh is a unique mesh. So is this, even though they are the same inside Maya, inside UE5, they are separate meshes. So that's just part of the workflow that I use that has that one downside, that the meshes that were duplicated in Maya, when you import them into UE5, they're essentially separate meshes and not the same mesh being used twice. And that was my entire texturing process workflow. You just find the material instance or the material that you want to use and just drag them onto these surfaces and begin to find the theme and the look for the environment. Now, one important part when you begin to work with different materials and start dragging them onto walls, and here's another level of having different material IDs. So for this wall, I have 2 material IDs to this. So that allows me to have one material on certain parts of the mesh and then another one for, let's say, the pillars. So because you're going to be using different materials that may have certain materials are going to be darker, others are going to be lighter, it helps to switch over unlit mode. So that way you get to see the albedo, the color texture, without any lighting. And then you can begin to tweak using the material instance properties that are provided for you to make them match in saturation and in brightness. So this helped me a lot to texture the environment, because if you just simply drag many of these to certain parts, many of these will be just too dark. And I already tweaked a lot of these. Like for example, maybe this color just doesn't match. It's too saturated, and it's kind of hard to tell using lit mode because we haven't lit this environment at all. It just has the default lighting. But then when you switch over to the unlit mode, you can see it in more uniformity, and you can kind of make sure that all the textures and all the materials have very similar saturation and color. So if you open up any of the material instances from Megascans, you'll have many properties for you to adjust how that material looks inside the level. So for this, I would change the albedo tint. I could change the color, maybe make it darker. In this case, actually, I would want to, under albedo controls, let's enable this and desaturate it a bit. So I would maybe do 0.5 and make it brighter, 1.5. So that kind of matches a little bit more towards the walls, rather than have that more of a brown color to it. And I use this quite a lot to make sure that my albedo in unlit mode matched and had that uniformity to it. And here's the final textured environment with all the adjustments made to the different materials that I used. Let me go ahead and disable the decals, so you get to see it purely textured without any decals. So you can see that there is a uniform quality to it. Nothing is too bright or too dark, and the colors kind of match between each other. So this is one important tip that I suggest you begin using, whether you use the Megascan materials or your own. And here is the final lit environment without any decals. So let me put it back to lit mode. Next part of the process comes the decals. A decal is a material that can be projected onto other materials and helping you to add additional layer of detail without having to add that detail, such as cracks, dirt, leakage, into the main material itself. Also, in addition to that, many of the textures, the materials that I use for Megascans are clean, meaning they're tileable and they look pretty good across a larger surface. There's no seemingly repeatable pattern. Well, there's some, but mostly you can use them across a large surface and there's a minimal repeatable pattern. But to add a bit more history, a bit more story, and to break up the tileable textures that Megascans has, is to use decals. And I use decals in this environment, in this project, to dirty things up and to introduce that level of damage that I did not want to introduce into modeling. So most of this environment was modeled with basic shapes. It's clean, it's smooth, but with textures and then with decals, you can really dirty this up. So right now I have decals turned off. And if I go ahead and enable them, it really brings the environment and infuses it with a bit more history and a bit more life. So it has dirt, it has numbers, it has water leakage, it has some pebbles, some cracks. And I could continue, adding additional passes of this grunge and this dirt through this environment with decals alone. All of these decals were also from Quixel Bridge Megascans. And you'll find many of decals to use to download and apply onto your surfaces, onto your static meshes, under the decals category. And you can do leakage, you can do concrete, and many more. Again, refer to the guide to Quixel Bridge that I did for an in-depth look on how to use decals, how to download them, and how to just use them inside your projects with all the settings for them. So due to the type of the environment this was, decals were a great addition to add more detail into this environment. With many of the decals that I used, I also changed some of the properties inside the material instance. So for example, let me find this right here, this kind of projection, not the pebbles, but let me lift this up, select this, kind of some of this concrete detail. Let me find this decal inside the Megascans folder. Simply press Ctrl B, just like you do in static meshes, to find the decal inside the content browser. If I double click on this and take a look what it's doing, let me move this out of the way for just a little bit. You can adjust the albedo, color, overlay intensity, and then of course opacity intensity. These two values I used a lot. And actually those are the pebbles. Let me go ahead and make sure I select this one right here. Press Ctrl B again, let's open that one up. So this helps a lot to match the decal to the surface behind it. By default, a lot of these, they were too strong. The decals were very strong. And by adjusting a lot of these, you can kind of blend them to the surface, more or less, depending on the color of the material that you're using behind it. And I used primarily the overlay intensity, color overlay, and opacity intensity to control how these decals will look inside the environment and how much they're blended with the material behind it. And the little sticker note that you see, those are all decals inside the environment. Another useful thing with decals you can do, in addition to kind of break up the repetition of the texture behind it, is to hide seams. So for example, this decal right here, the crack, if I move it, you can see a line. So this is a separation, a texture seam. And you can use this decal to position on top to hide those texture seams. The one important thing about decals when you use them, make sure that you are lowering the extent of projection box to only apply for specific area. By default, when you drag many of these decals, the bounding box is going to be huge. So you have to control the scale, make it smaller, and then make sure you make it smaller on Z-axis in height. So it only projects down for a small area, and it's not trying to encompass around the rest of the meshes around wherever you have that decal projection. And if you don't want certain meshes to receive decals, select that static mesh, and inside the details panel, type in decal, and you can disable receive decals. And then that mesh will not receive any decals at all. So decals were a very large part of detailing this environment, and it added a lot to the final piece. Next up is lighting. So once you have your texturing and decals done, you have to light the environment. So before you do any post-process, any color grading, or add any fog, you have to light it first. Because all of these effects rely on the lighting to be done before you can apply them. So this environment is lit with indirect lighting. There is no direct lights that are hitting anything inside this tunnel, inside this underground bunker. And the only light is from up above, from the direction light, and it's only touching this upper portion, and that's it. And everything else is indirectly lit with bounced light. So I actually have a couple of rectangular lights. I'm going to turn them off temporarily, and I'll come back to them in just a second. And there are a couple of things going on in order for you to begin lighting, in this case, indirectly lit environments. The first thing, of course, is let's come back to post-process volume. This needs to be inside the scene, because we are controlling two important properties I mentioned before. First, we have unbound, infinite extent unbound enabled, means this post-process volume will work for the entire environment and we don't have to be inside it for it to take effect. And then exposure. This is the most important part to get started. Now I went ahead and enabled metering mode, set it to manual, Exposure compensation is set to 14 as my final environment value, and then also enabled apply physical camera exposure. These are the properties that I used for this specific environment, and I used this specific option. The other option, as I mentioned, you can just simply enable minimum and maximum EV100 values and set them both to 1. This will also disable auto exposure, and you can kind of play around with these values to adjust the exposure inside the environment. But instead of this option, I use this one right here. Both will work, and it just depends on which one you want to use more. Just this one gives you a little bit more control, and I like the exposure compensation value, so you can adjust it in order to have more light in certain parts of the environment in order to compensate for the exposure. So that's the first part in controlling your lighting. The second part is, of course, having the lighting actors inserted inside the level. I used new level and the basic map template. So that provides you with a directional light, exponential height fog, which we'll talk about later. So in terms of lighting itself, directional light, it's already inserted for you. And then you have sky atmosphere, skylight, and these are it's actually skylight and directional light, and then post process. Those are the three main actors that you need to begin to light with. The sky atmosphere gives you a skybox around the level, which works with the skylight. So you do need sky atmosphere in order to make the skylight work. So skylight will introduce indirectly lit lighting into your environment. So if I went ahead and disable skylight, you can see we kind of we remove certain bounce light from the environment. And if you enable this, then we can infuse it with more bounce light. Now, depending on the style of the environment you're going for, maybe this is what you're going for. So you just gonna have to play around with the values and with the actors. Again, it's all in the end the art direction that you've taken, but for this specific environment, I want it to be more real to true life, so I needed that skylight. So the skylight enables you to have the indirectly bounced light in here, and the few properties you want to take a look at when you're dealing with this is intensity scale. So this will infuse more bounce light into the indirect environment areas. So by default it was 1, and I just bumped it up just a little bit. You can kind of see it, but let me bump it up to 5. You can see that it infuses with more light. So I just bumped it up 1.5. The next important actor you need to adjust, and you kind of go back and forth between these two, the skylight and the directional light. So that's the next one. Directional light, you need to orient and kind of position and point your directional light, the sunlight, so it shines into your environment the way you want it to. The way you do that, so you don't have to select the actor, because I would have to find it somewhere. It's actually right here in the center. But you don't have to actually have the little cursor around it so you can position it. If you press Control L and just move the mouse as you hold down Control L, then you can kind of dynamically position the light anywhere inside your scene. So you don't have to select that actor, or you have to select it, but you don't have to position the cursor over the rotation gizmo. And then just find the way you would want it to light your environment. Let me go ahead and undo. And I use this kind of angle to come in, so I get to see some of the directional light, actual light hitting the surfaces, but so it can bounce more light into this interior. And then of course for the properties for the directional light, I have intensity set, and then I used temperature to make it a bit cooler. So temperature allows you to control the temperature of the light in real world values. Lower will be warmer and higher will be cooler. So it goes from 0 to 10,000. So if I bump this up to 10,000, it'll be more cooler light. If I go down to, let's say, 2,500, it'll be more warmer light. So 7,500, it's usually good for midday, kind of the direction of the light, midday sun. And then you also have a good value. I did not tweak this because I'll show you something in post process that I did. But you have indirect lighting intensity, and this will also allow you, in addition to the skylight, will allow you to control indirect lighting intensity inside the indirectly lit areas of the environment to kind of infuse it with more bounce light. So if I left it at 1, but let's say you wanted to use this value, you can type in 2, and you can see it infuses more light. There is more bounced indirect light beginning to enter into this environment. So I left this at 1, but this is a good value to also work with. The other value that I adjusted to get more light from my textures, from the materials, from the albedo, is the diffuse boost. And you get this property inside the post-process volume. So let me select it, and inside the details panel you go and search for lumen. And right here, diffuse color boost. So by default, it was set to 1. You can see that kind of darkens it. So what it does, it uses the texture, the albedo color, which has a lot to do with lumen, and it infuses more light and bounces more light back into the environment from the color of the albedo texture. So if I had all darker textures, I would not get as much bounce light. And if I had all bright white textures, it would bounce a lot more light inside this environment. So you can kind of compensate for the texture being darker by using the diffuse color boost inside post-process volume. So I used it to and bumped it up to 1.5. So for example, I can go all the way to 5, which is going to be very bright, kind of unrealistic. So 1.5 was my value. So you use these 3 actors to start with: the directional light, the skylight, and then the post-process volume, and kind of working with diffuse color boost. Now you don't always have to enable this. You can do very similar things with the directional light, but if you needed to have that extra boost from the color, then post-process volume is a great way to adjust this value. Now when you are dealing with lighting indirectly lit environment, basically no directional lights are in here and all you're using is in direct bounce light, you can get some issues with lumen having some flickering issues, as well as there is just not enough bounce light. So you might have, not always, depending on how you light it, but you might have some noise and some flickering going on. So what can help a lot to light indirectly lit environments is to introduce some additional direct light, and I did this through a rectangular light. So what I did was I inserted a directional light, not a directional, rectangular light right here up above, and it's kind of hard to see, but because I disabled it, but I'm gonna go ahead and enable it. Actually, let me come back and I'm gonna enable it. So I put a rectangular light up above and also one up above in the second hole. So it drops in and infuses more light from a direct source, not just from the bounce light. So here's the first one. I inserted a rectangular light and I just made sure that it positioned right through the hole right here, and it's pointing down and it's emitting more light into the environment. And the properties I set for this, I just play around with intensity and then temperature, same temperature as my directional light. And I did the same thing, I just copied it over for the other hole. So essentially I have 2 additional rectangular lights that are infusing this environment with more light, and it helps to eliminate any of those issues that you might have with lumen, with noise and flickering. And that is it for lighting. That's all I did. Only few actors to light the scene. You just have to work with the values and adjust them properly while watching what's happening in your environment. And one last thing I did do, and you might also want to take a look at this property, is in post-process volume. And let me type in lumen. If you're using lumen, right here inside the lumen global illumination, final gather quality. If you increase this, can also help with noise and just increase the fidelity and the quality of your scene. This does come at a performance cost, but it will make your environments look better. Next is fog. Now you do need to have the preliminary lighting done through the directional light and the skylight and whatever else you've inserted, any other artificial lights. For me, it was the rectangular light, because the fog relies on the environment and its color from the lights to create the fog effect. And I have 2 different fog actors. I have the default exponential height fog, and let me go ahead and disable it and show you before and after. So Alt F is the shortcut key. So if I enable, you can see that without fog, it looks very bland. There's no atmosphere, there's no vibe or mood to it, and it's missing something. And then with the fog, it just adds that much needed effect. So the exponential height fog was inserted for me from the basic map template, but of course you can find it inside the visual effects tab. And the properties that I tweaked were the fog density, fog height fall off, the fog in scattering color just to match it to the scene, and that was it. So I didn't tweak too many properties, just enough to have fog kind of in the distance in the back of the environment and kind of match it up to the basic lighting that I've had set up. And then for the rest of the color of the environment, I could do that with color grading with post-process volume, which we'll cover in just a bit, which was my last step. And also, in addition to the exponential height fog, I do have right here on the bottom, in below underground into those tunnels, another actor, another fog actor, local height fog right here. So if I go ahead and disable it, if I didn't use this, you can see that it has a bit of emissive quality to it. And I had a hard time tweaking the exponential height fog, but also at the same time trying to remove this kind of glow effect of the fog. And I wasn't going to achieve that result. So I needed another way to create a layer of fog only in areas, specific areas of the environment, but not getting rid of this effect that I like of the exponential height fog and the distance. So to do this, I use local height fog and kind of inserted an additional layer of fog below ground, even further down into the ground. And this is a new actor which you can find. I'm using 5.3, and if you go to visual effects, here's you have local height fog. You can just drag this and it'll give you some properties for you to control, and it's a local area fog. So before you had to create a material, apply it to a mesh, and just gonna do more of the work by having to set that up. But now you can use this actor and it gives you all the properties for to control fog density, color, and everything else for only specific areas of the environment where you want to have a local height fog. So let me come back up, and the only properties I tweaked for it is of course the density, the fog height fall off, offset, scattering distribution. Again, just playing around with the values until I get the result of the fog that I needed, and the fog albedo. And then of course I also needed to resize the fog, so it's only occupying this area of the environment underneath where the underground tunnels are. And if I went ahead and move this, it would remove that fog and introduce something else. So it's a very specific area that I needed to have this local fog effect take place. And local height fog is a great way to do so. So you can see that the fog added a great effect to the environment, and without it, it would be missing something. For the final step is color grading or color correction. This is a post-process effect that gets applied to the entire scene. Or you could apply it to certain parts of the environment using various multiple post-process volumes. You should have your entire environment completed, textured, and lit before you do any post-process effects to it. So this is the last layer, the last step of your environment. So for this environment, I wanted to have multiple visual looks for it. So to do this quickly without having to create multiple volumes with color grading settings applied in each, I simply created multiple LUTs. LUT is an image that contains color information. And by using post-process volume and an LUT setting in it, I can change what this environment will look like. So I have post-process volume here. Let me go ahead and select it. And if you scroll down, or you can just search for LUT, but you'll find it under miscellaneous right here. Color grading LUT. Let me go ahead and disable it. So here's the default lighting and everything else applied to it. It's very bland, but it has everything done. It has all the right settings, intensities, and as much color as I could get from the directional light and from the skylight. But then you do another pass for color grading, for color correction. So I did 4 different LUTs. So let me go ahead and enable. So this is, let me drag the first one. So here's the first one. Here's the second one. Kind of gives you a different mood and feel for the environment. Here's the third one. And here's the fourth one. Warmer. So the first 3 were cooler colors, and the last one I wanted to try out a warm vibe, a warm color. Now you can do these very easily by grabbing a screenshot of your environment and then bringing it into Photoshop and then using adjustment layers to change the levels, the brightness, color balance, contrast, saturation, and so on. And then you save out an LUT image, which is a small image that's 256 by 16 that contains this color information, and then you simply plug it into your post-process volume color grading LUT section, and then you have intensity, the amount that you want to apply from that LUT. I have an in-depth tutorial you may want to take a look at that takes you step by step on how to create these LUTs yourself and all the settings and properties you need to adjust and change to make it work. So this was the last step in the process, and this allowed me to quickly change out the look of the environment depending on what I wanted to go with. Now there are many other effects that you can control with the post-process volume. I mean, you have temperature, you have global, you have shadows, midtones. This is a way to adjust color balance and saturation and contrast for each of the parts of the environment. So if you weren't going to use LUTs, you would go through color grading section and adjust the global properties, and then go into shadows, midtones, and highlights to control the color and saturation of the scene. You also, if you scroll up above, you have image effects, you have depth of field you can control, and few other properties that you can adjust the final outlook, the final image, and the visuals of your environment. So post-process volume has a lot of properties for you to change how your environment, your final visuals of your environment will look. So some final thoughts on this project. This was a purely experimental project for an idea that I had for a while, and I wanted to execute it, but I just never found the time until I decided to jump in and experiment with a different workflow that I usually don't use. And I found this to be a very quick way to get your environment done, where the entire modeling process focused in Maya. You can detail, you can UV, then you can quickly bring things into UE5 just to check how it will look. You can even quickly light it, get a mood and feel and the scale and the dimensions and proportions and the overall vibe of the place, of the environment. And then go back and continue modeling further. So this eliminated a lot of the modular creation that you would usually have to do, and then having to reconstruct the environment back in UE5, which sometimes takes some time because you have to set up the modular pieces, you have to test them, and then you have to recreate the environment. And this process was way faster. Now, of course, there are downsides, and major downside is I can't expand on the environment because everything is its own unique static mesh and all the pivot points and world origins. So it's not like I can just take something and then duplicate it and continue to create the environment. It would make it difficult to do. I could, but then I should have used a different workflow. So I had no intention of expanding on the environment past this point. Also, for the type of environment this was a large architectural set piece environment. It worked perfectly with tile and textures, so this allowed me to also use Megascans surfaces and texture this environment very quickly. And I may not have been able to use this if I had more unique pieces that needed to be textured individually, such as for many specific assets that have to have specific areas of texturing done. And of course, for props usually need to be uniquely textured. Not always, but for the most part, this process would not have worked for some other environment. So I will definitely continue to use this process. I love this workflow. And when the right criteria for the environment shows up, I will absolutely come back and reuse this workflow for another project. Now, if you want to learn how to create your own custom game environments, how to model, how to UV, as well as how to use UE5 to create and light with, take a look at a series of premium tutorial courses that I have on worldofleveldesign.com. It'll take you from the very beginning and guide you through every step for how to begin using Maya for modeling and UVing, and how to begin using UE5 to create and to light with.